The 74th annual Tony Awards were postponed back in March of 2020 at the onset of COVID-19. I don't know, maybe you've heard about this? Now, with the Broadway League's announcement to resume performances in the fall, the Tonys are finally going ahead at the end of September. And that's exciting, yes, but if we're being honest, the situation is still quite precarious, and there's still a lot of uncertainty as the theater industry cautiously resumes business. So, while the long-delayed ceremonies will absolutely acknowledge the accomplished works of the 2019-2020 Broadway season, the broadcast will be about far more than just the awards. And in reality, that's always been the case for the Tonys. Throughout its history, the Tony Awards have reflected how the theater industry adapts with the changing times, whether it's receptive to new ideas and stories, or tenaciously taking a stand, stubbornly clinging to tradition. And while the Tonys have always awarded distinguished work in the theater, its annual broadcast has become an important promotional event for the Broadway theater, celebrating its community while also trying to market its own industry, a far cry from its humble beginnings. For this episode, we're going to dive into the history of the Tony Awards. But before we do so, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button. All support helps, and it's just a click away. If you are really paying attention, you'd of course know that the Tony Awards are named after this woman, Antoinette Perry, or as her close friends called her, Tony. Born in 1888, she started her professional career as an actress, making her Broadway debut in 1906. Within 3 years, though, she would leave the theater, at the insistence of her new husband, to raise a family. But after his death in 1922 and receiving a sizable fortune of $9 million,
good for her,
Perry decided to return to her stage career. She would go on to tell an interviewer, "There's no charm in a life of leisure. I yearn to return to my other love. Should I go on playing bridge and dining, going in the same old monotonous circle? It's easy that way, but a sort of suicide too." In 1928, Perry shifted her focus to stage directing, joining the ranks of women like Rachel Crothers, who had been writing and directing her own works for years. Crothers was a suffragette, and part of a group of women that banded together to create the Theater Women's War Relief in 1917. This organization would one day ultimately become the American Theater Wing, where Antoinette Perry acted as secretary and eventually as chairwoman. Perry, by all accounts, was known as a passionate and prolific theater director, sometimes also acting as producer, alongside her frequent partner and friend, Brock Pemberton. Perry's biggest success came in 1944, directing Mary Chase's comedy, Harvey, which would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize for Drama and later be adapted into a film starring Jimmy Stewart. After her death in 1946, Brock Pemberton and the American Theater Wing headed a committee to form a new annual theater award called the Antoinette Perry Awards. They would serve to memorialize the memory of the late director, while also recognizing and awarding distinguished work in the Broadway theater, just as the Academy Awards had acknowledged distinguished work in the film industry for 20 years. For these awards, there would be no denominations of best. Rather, recipients would be recognized for outstanding achievements. Nominees, selected by a committee of theater luminaries, would not be announced in advance, and only the winners would be shared with the public. The winners, of course, would be told in advance so they would actually show up to accept their award. The inaugural Antoinette Perry Awards were held in the Grand Ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel on April 6, 1947. Admission was $7.50 and open to members of the public, accounting for about 1,200 guests. The evening included dinner, dancing, and entertainment from casts of Broadway shows like Brigadoon, Call Me Mr., and Finian's Rainbow, though not the full production numbers we think of seeing today. In total, 11 awards were distributed that evening, including both Agnes DeMille and Michael Kidd being recognized for their respective choreographic work that year. For the first 2 years, there was no actual trophy to hand out. Instead, winners were given a scroll with an initialed sterling silver compact case for the women and engraved gold clips or cigarette lighters for the men. Then in 1949, designer Herman Rossi created the silver medallion for the Tony. The face of the medallions features the traditional comedy and tragedy masks, and the reverse side carrying a relief of the profile of Antoinette Perry. It wasn't until 1968 that the medallion would be mounted on a pedestal for the first time, becoming the award we commonly recognize today. At some point during that inaugural ceremony in 1947, Brock Pemberton was handing a recipient their award, and innocently referred to it as a Tony. The name stuck, and within a few years, the Antoinette Perry Awards would be commonly referred to as the Tonys. From its first year, the Tonys had been broadcast over the radio through local New York networks. But the advent of television would soon change everything. The Academy Awards started airing from Los Angeles in 1953, and the inaugural NBC broadcast was watched by approximately 40 million people, at the time about a quarter of the population of the United States.
But isn't it exciting to know that a lot of these glamorous stars are going to be in your homes tonight? All over America, housewives are turning to their husbands and saying, "Put on your shirt, Joan Crawford is coming." Television, that's where movies go when they die.
After the Emmy Awards began televising their ceremonies in 1955, the American Theater Wing would feel pressure to make the transition to television as well. So on April 1st, 1956, the Tonys were televised for the first time on New York Channel 5 from the Grand Ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. It was also this year that the American Theater Wing began to make changes to help stimulate public interest in the awards. For the first time, nominees were announced to the public ahead of the ceremony, just as the Oscars had done for several years. And by the end of the 1950s, the Wing would begin denominating all awards with Best in their respective categories. It wasn't until 1967 that the Tonys became a national television event, under the guidance of Alexander Cohen, a Broadway producer in his own right. Rather than the traditional dinner proceedings at a hotel ballroom, the American Theater Wing teamed with the League of American Theaters and Producers, what we now know as the Broadway League, to create the first national telecast for the Tony Awards, set for March 26, 1967. Sponsored by American Airlines, ABC would broadcast the ceremony from the Schubert Theater on 44th Street. With Mary Martin and Robert Preston acting as hosts, each nominee for Best Musical would perform a number from their show, like Joel Grey in the cast of Cabaret, which opened the ceremony.
Welcome and bienvenue, welcome. Français, étranger, stranger.
Cabaret was a big winner that year, taking home 8 awards including Best Musical. The broadcast itself was also a major success, with 38 million tuning in to watch. In the days that followed, Broadway producers saw just how much the telecast could generate business. For instance, the weekly grosses of Harold Pinter's play, The Homecoming, jumped from 14,000 to 40,000, the week after it won Best Play on national television. The Tonys, in effect, could sell Broadway. For nearly 2 decades, programs like The Ed Sullivan Show had done just that, providing a reliable showcase for Broadway and its stars. But as the 1960s wore on and the musical theater seemed more and more out of touch with popular culture, the Tony Awards would become an important television event that would help promote the Broadway theater and lure audiences to New York City. From its inception, the Tony Awards were exclusively run by the American Theater Wing, with nominating and voting committees comprised of board members. But when they partnered with the Broadway League for the first national telecast, they granted them license to operate the awards, giving them a large degree of control over the Tonys and the chance to revise the nomination process, basically to what we know today. They devised 3 committees. First, the Administrative Committee, who see every Broadway show, I repeat, every Broadway show that opens that season. Throughout the year, this committee will meet and determine what shows are eligible for particular categories. They submit their findings to the Nominating Committee, who narrow the list down to make up the nominees for that year. From there, the list is considered by the Tony voters, comprising of members of the American Theater Wing, the Broadway League, American Actors Equity, the Dramatists Guild, United Scenic Artists, and the Stage Directors and Choreographers Society. Basically, members from all facets of the theater world. To become a Tony voter, you must be a member of one of these organizations. An allotment is given to each of them to select members in good standing. The selection process can vary depending on the organization. In the case of the Tony voter I spoke to, an internal lottery was in place. By becoming a Tony voter, you are committing to see every show that is under consideration, and for the bulk of voters who are usually outside of the New York area, this can be an especially stressful commitment. Many voters may have to forge time out of their schedules, book hotels, or stay with friends in order to take in shows. It is possible, of course, that a voter might miss a show, though the Tony administrators really don't like this. Remember, if you miss a show, you cannot vote in any category that show is eligible for. So, frankly, it's probably in the voters' best interest to see every show nominated so they can actually vote. In the past, votes were cast by mail, but in more recent years, they are submitted electronically, and the voters find out the winners right along with everyone else at the same time.
Hamilton.
It definitely can be fun to be a Tony voter, but it is also a long, exhaustive process that requires tremendous commitment and thoughtful consideration. The Tonys are an example of how art and commerce intersect in show business, and the organizations that present the awards also exemplify this. The American Theater Wing, a charitable organization that promotes education and helps develop professional opportunities, and the Broadway League, which represents producers and theater owners across the United States. Ever since the Broadway League took over producing the Tonys in 1967, there has always been some varying form of contention through the years between these two organizations. Representation within the voting process has always been a heated point of discussion. For many years, the body of the administrative and nominating committees were dominated by producers, critics, and theater academics, and many argue that there wasn't enough representation of artists. On the eve of the 1984 Tonys, the four unions of theater professionals went into galvanizing talks with the league, demanding more inclusion within those committees, which at the time had no artist representation. Most producers opposed this idea, with Emanuel Eisenberg calling their concerns self-righteous and silly, adding that the inclusion of more artists to the electorate would bring more politics than expertise. In a hypothetical scenario, this would mean that artists would vote against foreign actors or plays competing against domestic entries. Eisenberg would go on to say, "If I had to leave it up to Actors Equity, who was nominated for Best Actor, you wouldn't see a foreign actor nominated. You wouldn't see Jeremy Irons nominated this year." He's speaking from personal stake here. As a producer, he represented Tom Stoppert's play, The Real Thing, which was nominated and won for Best Play that year, and where Jeremy Irons did end up winning the Tony Award for Best Actor. The most important point of these conversations is to have adequate representation within the process, and through the years, these conversations have evolved, where the body of these committees should diversify to reflect the fabric of the culture at hand. There are countless discourses of the Tony Awards I could get into here. There's been a long advocacy to include off-Broadway shows to the awards, specifically theaters with less than 500 seats. Other debates through the years have included nominees being placed in the wrong categories, perceived snubs from the nominating committee, designers and writers not receiving due attention during the telecast. And I want to make it clear, these are all valid discussions we should be having, and conversations that do keep the Tony producers on their toes. In the 1980s, ratings for the ceremony had begun to slip drastically. The 1996 broadcast received the lowest ratings ever in Tony Awards history, and rumors spread that CBS, who had consistently broadcast the show since 1978, were seriously thinking of cutting the show altogether. However, Peter Lund, then the president of CBS, still held faith in the show's future. "We have every intention of doing the show next year. This is just a worthwhile thing to do. It's part of New York and part of our country. It's special. It's the theater. I feel certain we'd like to keep doing this broadcast indefinitely." A few days after this article was published, NBC premiered a new daytime variety talk show, The Rosie O'Donnell Show, which became an almost instant success for the network. Rosie, an unapologetic fan of Broadway, regularly dedicated airtime to feature performances from Broadway shows and interviews with its stars. When approached to host the 1997 Tony Awards and promote them on her popular syndicated show, she reportedly agreed on the condition that they move from the traditional Broadway theater to Radio City Music Hall. Traditionalists within the industry hated the idea, evoking the old resistance to use the grandeur of shows like the Academy Awards as a paradigm for success. But after years of dismal ratings and a tired format, the Tony producers were obviously willing to try something new. To help fill up Radio City's 6,000 seats, tickets would be sold to members of the public for the first time in years. On June 1st, 1997, the 51st Annual Tony Awards marked the first live broadcast from Radio City. With Rosie's profile, they expanded the show from 2 hours to 3, and the opening number featured Rosie along with casts of Broadway shows running at the time. This kind of production is now expected at the Tony Awards, but this was the first time it was ever done on such a scale. And if you compare the 1996 and 1997 ceremonies, both of which you can find on YouTube, there's an undeniable excitement in the audience that transcends the broadcast. Rosie O'Donnell's involvement evidently paid off, with 29 million tuning into the broadcast, a 35% increase from the previous year. She would host at Radio City 3 more times, but the ceremonies rarely met the same level of excitement that started in 1997. Since then, Tony producers have continued to take on high-profile celebrities to play as host, like Hugh Jackman, Whoopi Goldberg, Neil Patrick Harris, James Corden, and remember when this happened? Yikes. Radio City Music Hall has remained the preferred venue to host the awards, save for 1999, which was hosted at the Gershwin Theater, and Uptown at the Beacon Theater on 3 occasions, usually due to Radio City's previous commitment to other events, which of course brings us up to today. With the onset of COVID-19, Broadway performances effectively halted on March 12, 2020, leaving the Tony committees with some difficult decisions to make. To be eligible for Tony nominations, shows needed to have opened by April 23rd, but with the shutdown, the committee rolled the date back to February 19th, a decision that would affect a number of shows, namely Girl from the North Country, that opened a week before the shutdown, and the revival of West Side Story, which opened on February 20th, 1 day shy of the cutoff. This decision could come off as incredibly petty, but there's a practical logic to it. To actually be considered, Tony voters need to see your show. And while there are voters who attend productions before nominations are announced, it's safe to say that these shows would not have been properly vouched for. A hard decision that may have been one of many contributing factors to West Side Story's recent closing notice. As it became clear that the shutdown would stretch longer than anticipated, the Tony producers wisely decided to postpone the ceremony. In its place, CBS would air a sing-along broadcast of Grease, which I did not watch. Nominees were eventually announced in October of 2020, with voters casting their ballots in March of 2021. But uncertainty within the industry would keep the date of this ceremony elusive. Hypothetically, the Broadway League could have moved ahead with a digital ceremony, as initially projected, and then wait for the industry to pick up. But as I've talked about before, the Tony Awards promote Broadway, and trying to promote an industry with no clear path to return would be counterintuitive. At this point, we are by no means out of the woods in this pandemic, but thanks to science, of which we are big fans on this channel, the Broadway League has begun the industry's gradual return, and Broadway will soon be in business again. The 74th Annual Tony Awards will take place on September 26, 2021, at the Winter Garden Theater, almost a year to the day after nominations were announced. True to the unprecedented circumstances, the broadcast will have an unprecedented format in 2 portions, divided between Paramount Plus and CBS. Those details I have linked below. So, what will the long-delayed ceremony be about this year? Obviously, we'll finally get to recognize and celebrate distinguished work from the nominees, But beyond simply handing out the awards, the Tony producers have a lot to address with this year's ceremony. The year and a half of lost work, the people we lost throughout the pandemic, and most importantly, a sense of hope about the return of the theater. The Broadway League's recent ad campaign, This is Broadway, most definitely will have some presence in the ceremony, in an effort to boost morale and hopefully lure audiences to New York City. Think back to their I Love New York campaign that followed in the days after 9/11. The spirit of both campaigns is pure Broadway. And while they may evade their own harsh realities, their hope and optimism is undeniable and absolutely necessary in moving forward. In my opinion, Broadway and the Tony Awards are at their best when they address the present moment, whether that's the culture at large or even the fractious relations within the community itself. I mean, really, take your pick right now. They may be incredibly timely and very uncomfortable to address, but in denying them, how can we possibly move forward? Sentiments like "the show must go on" can only go so far without being realistic about the challenges we face in the coming days. It may be silly to put such stock in an awards show, but even I can't deny the power of the show's impact. I often think back to the first year I watched the Tonys, on my parents' tiny kitchen TV with the volume turned way down. I don't think I had any real idea of how the Broadway theater worked, but the show made that world seem irresistible, exciting. It made me want to go to New York and see these performers in the flesh. It gave me, well, hope. The Antoinette Perry Awards have come a long way since their inception, from memorializing the memory of a great director to a prestigious award show that promotes and sells the legacy of Broadway. This will be a very different kind of Tony Awards ceremony, to the point that I'd argue the winners are almost irrelevant this year. For all of Broadway theater is on the line, and the kind of competitiveness we've seen in past seasons will be totally useless here. So hopefully, you, yes you, will tune in to watch the Tonys this year, appreciate its legacy, and support the theater however you can. Now, who's gonna lend me their Paramount Plus password? Thank you for watching this episode. If you want to see more of this content, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button. A special shout out to Mark Benani, who helped me out with some footage, the Tony voter who let me in on their process, and this subscriber who suggested this video. When did you start watching the Tonys? What have been your favorite memories through the years, and what do you hope to see on this year's telecast? Let me know in the comments below, and once again, make sure to like, subscribe, and show this channel some love. Till next time, stay tuned.